Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're going to talk a little bit about milk. Got some milk here. And I'm going to do the unthinkable for approximately 70% of the people around the world. I am going to consume this raw milk. And we're going to see what happens by the end of the lecture. Let's move to the next slide. I'm sure you've heard people say that drinking milk, it's unnatural, right? They say that no animal in nature drinks milk. Well, yeah, for about 70% of humans, they don't possess a mutation. They don't have a mutation that allows them to continue to produce lactase, which is an enzyme. In contrast, approximately 30% of people, they do. They have that lactase enzyme. And this is a product of evolution. So to say that it's not natural, that's ultimately to deny the process of evolution and natural selection over time. Now, looking at this, milk, as pointed out, for a lot of individuals, it is toxic. They lack an enzyme that allows them to digest lactose, and lactose is a sugar. And that can cause problems for individuals if you are lactose intolerant. That intolerance, it does produce some pretty drastic consequences for individuals who did what I just did a second ago. Now, about this mutation. As pointed out, there was a mutation in history, in our past, and this probably doesn't emerge until around 7,000 years before the present. So that's my X chromosome. And right about here on this arm of the chromosome, there's a gene that's referred to as MC, M6, and this is the switch. The switch gene, for some individuals, it turns off and they can't consume, ideally, milk. However, some individuals can. So right about there, something took place, and that's a product of evolution, so it is entirely natural. The other thing is the ability to drink milk, it occurred or it took place over time. Individuals had to learn how to refine milk. They didn't simply start drinking raw milk. They were using milk as a resource, and it probably started out this way, producing yogurt, producing cheese. So yogurt and cheese in this process, it reduces the amount of lactose in the milk, and then eventually individuals started consuming raw milk, and then we are today, where we're producing lactose-free milk. Let's move to the next slide. So in archaeology, we have some pretty good evidence for the this revolution of dairying, or evidence for first dairying, and it comes from a region referred to as the Zagros Mountains, so in the Middle East. And the specific area, at least the archaeological site that we're talking about, is referred to as Al-Kosh. And at Al-Kosh, we have zooarchaeologists, in addition to bioarchaeologists, excavating and counting bones. So they're counting and they're assessing the remains. Now, some of the things that they're interested in, for example, whether or not the individual is male. So in anthropology, we don't think that males come from Mars, so we don't use that symbol. We use the triangle to signify, and here I'll just, for reference sake, individuals that either identify their gender as male or they are biologically male. In contrast, the symbol of a circle is used to identify somebody who is biological or who identifies their gender as female. So these are one of the things that we're interested in, counting the males versus the females. The other thing we're interested in, I'm just going to squeeze it underneath, is the age of the individuals that are being slaughtered. And go right up to the top. Before or prior to 11,000 years before the present, we see that there's an equal distribution of males and females and young as well. So what this means is ultimately they're engaging in subsistence, foraging, they're hunting and gathering, and they kill what they can kill, they slaughter it, and they eat it. After 11,000 years before the present, we see a change. We see an unequal distribution. What's happened is we see a different relationship between males. We see a lot of males present in the kill sites, plus a lot of young animals. For example, at Al-Qash, they look at sheep, they look at cattle. So we see a different distribution. And what this tells us is females are being seen as a resource, and we're engaging in a new era where resource management has become important. So refined milk, the first evidence for dairying, it comes from the Middle East, Neolithic farmers at approximately 11,000 years before the present. And what these bioarchaeologists and zooarchaeologists have identified is an excess of adolescent cattle remains and plus males. And, you know, with respect to males, for example, males as a resource, they're not that valuable. You only need, I'm going to go down here, a couple of males to, here's the sign for marry, and we'll use that for inseminate here. Here's our females. You only need a couple of males to inseminate a number of females. And for example, if we get hungry, well, let's get rid of this guy right here. We still have 2 male sheep that can continue to inseminate these females. Well, okay, we can eat this one here, and this individual, he can go on to continue to inseminate those females. So like I said, we're seeing an interesting type of behavior here emerge. And what this also begins to indicate is that the young were being slaughtered and the mothers were being milked. So this tells us that females were seen as a resource, and this is the beginning of resource management among humans. Okay, let's move to the next slide. As I've explained to you, we should always ask, how do you know? Not me personally. How do anthropologists know? How do they know what? Well, here that humans were using milk and consuming it circa 11,000 years before the present. So that's a good question. For example, we have a pottery shard here on the right-hand side of the screen, and this is a sieve. If we were to reconstruct it, I'll just give you an image down below. I'll sketch it out. It looks something like this, reconstructed with all kinds of little holes in it. And at one point of time, archaeologists said, we can figure out pretty much everything. And then along came a group of individuals and they said, no, you can't. Everything is a matter of interpretation. And it was referred to as post-processualism. post-processualism, just if you're looking for that. In contrast, the earlier phase was referred to as processualism. Now, there is a way that we can get at this, because lipids, for example, the lactose lipid, it kind of looks like this microscopically. It's an ugly little thing. And that can actually be found, with the right tools, embedded in the pottery. And we've already talked about this. We can figure out the age of the pottery as well. So if we begin to engage in something that's referred to as stable isotope analysis, okay, looking for those lipids, and we try to figure out the age of that pottery, and it comes back at about 11,000 years before the present, and then we discover that yes, there are milk lipids in this, that tells us that this pottery was used to process milk, and they were first using as discussed already to create yogurt. So brief points: milk fats, they're insoluble, so they ultimately stay in the pottery. They're absorbed into the ceramics, and through a process called stable isotope analysis, so those variants of our elements that don't decay away, they can easily be distinguished from other fats. For example, animal fats. Like I said, we've got this ugly little milk fat up there. So evidence for raw milk consumption, it comes from ceramics and also human genetics as well. And we had pointed out that that M6, which appears later on, that's the human genetic evidence. Let's move to the next slide. So to briefly sum up here what we've looked at, if we go to the Middle East, and we've talked about a site that we call Al-Qash in the Zagros mountains, we see that males are used differently than females. And we had pointed out that males, they were consumed along with young sheep as well. In contrast, females, they were protected resource because they produced something other than just their meat. And at that protected resource, we speculated what humans were after was milk. But we said we need something more than just bones here. We have this theory or hypothesis, and we need to prove that. So moving a little bit further along, we had talked, and I go up to this piece of pottery here. This piece of pottery that archaeologists discover. They look at that and they're able to engage in that stable isotope analysis. And what they look for are milk lipids, because they speculated that this was part of a sieve after they began to create or reconstruct the container. And they looked for those milk lipids. They found the milk lipids, and they were able to date the pottery, and were able to say absolutely humans, by this stage, conclusively, humans were using milk in their diet. No question about that. And by the time we get to 65,000 years ago, we have a well-established dairy economy, and by that time something else had needed to take place, and we talked a little bit about genetics. So here we have our X chromosome, and right there we pointed out this MC-M6 genetic change, this mutation, and that's present in these individuals. So really this illustrates this dairy diaspora, the dairying practices and how they spread from the Middle East to Europe as part of the Neolithic transition from hunting to gathering to agriculture. And we see that involved not only behavioral change, and also psychological, seeing things differently, but also biological change as well. Let's move to the next slide. So if you were worried about me, I'm back. I'm okay. Um, who had the mutation? Right? Who was it historically that had this change, this MC, M6 change? What I'll point out, it certainly wasn't people. It wasn't people with access to regular resources, right? You know, yogurt, that's one thing. And maybe people were developing a tolerance. Cheese, that's an entirely a different thing. As I pointed out, this is where milk drinking began. As for drinking raw milk, that's an entirely different thing. And it wouldn't have been people with access to regular resources such as yogurt, cheese, or even meat. They would have had no need to eat something that would cause a lot of pain and potential harm to them. So what archaeologists speculate, it was individuals that were poor, individuals that didn't have access. They didn't have access to resources. They were hungry, and they began to try drinking milk. You know, I remember watching the show, and they dropped a guy off in the desert and with absolutely no water, and they gave them a couple of cans of gasoline, and they said, what's going to end up happening is you're going to be so thirsty, you're going to look at the gasoline and you're going to say, no, I can't drink that. But eventually you're going to hit a point where you are unbelievably thirsty and you will try to drink the gasoline. You're not going to be able to stop it. So eventually we reached this point, and here, yeah, it was a horrific film. I can't remember what it was called, but either way, with respect to milk, people needed to try it, and it happened by chance. You know, this isn't planned or was about gaining tolerance over time. It was purely chance. It was random that there was a mutation. And they could consume those resources. And that's the way this dairying and this milk industry, the milk revolution, begins. Okay, we're going to leave it there because I'm taking up a lot of memory. Take care. Perhaps in two ways. Sorry.